The wind carried the smell of oil and salt across the gray waters of the North Atlantic. It was March 1943, and somewhere in the darkness below the waves, a German submarine captain leaned over a chart table, confident in the same belief every U-boat commander had held for years. Night belonged to them. For most of the war, that belief had been true. After sunset, the ocean turned into a hunter's playground for German submarines. Allied convoys crawled across the Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to Britain. Above the water, merchant ships moved slowly and blindly. Below the surface, U-boats waited. At night, the submarines would surface to recharge their batteries. Once on the surface, they became fast, almost as quick as destroyers, and nearly impossible to detect. Allied ships relied mostly on sonar, but sonar only worked against submarines underwater. When the U-boats surfaced, they vanished into darkness. Convoys burned in the night, while submarine commanders calmly wrote victory reports. The Germans called this period the happy time. Entire convoys disappeared in the Atlantic. Tankers exploded into towers of flame. Cargo ships broke apart under torpedo strikes. Lifeboats drifted for days in freezing water. By early 1942, U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be built. Britain, an island nation dependent on imported food, was approaching a breaking point. If the shipping lanes collapsed, Britain would starve. Somewhere far away from the Atlantic battlefields, in quiet offices and cluttered laboratories, a handful of scientists were trying to solve a problem that seemed almost absurd: how to see in the dark. The idea itself was simple. If aircraft could carry radar powerful enough to detect a submarine on the ocean surface, the entire strategy of the U-boat fleet would collapse overnight. But radar had limits. Early radar systems used long radio wavelengths, meters long. Those waves worked well against large targets like bomber formations or warships, but they struggled to detect small objects. A submarine's narrow conning tower barely reflected those signals. Worse still, the equipment was enormous. The antennas required to transmit long radio waves were huge metal structures. They worked well when mounted on tall towers along Britain's coast, but there was no way to fit them inside aircraft. To build radar small enough for airplanes, engineers needed something completely different: very short radio waves, only a few centimeters long. Microwaves. Short waves could bounce off smaller objects. They allowed tight radar beams. They required small antennas that could fit into aircraft noses or under wings. But there was a problem. Generating microwaves required enormous power, and in 1939 nobody had figured out how to produce that power efficiently. Laboratories around the world experimented with devices called klystrons. These machines could create microwaves, but only weak ones, just a few watts of power. Enough for experiments in physics labs. Not nearly enough to find a submarine in the middle of the ocean. For radar to work, engineers needed thousands of watts. That challenge seemed almost impossible. Yet during the darkest months of the war, British researchers managed to create exactly what was needed: a tiny metal device capable of generating microwaves far stronger than anything previously built. The invention spread quietly through secret laboratories. Soon it would travel across the Atlantic, hidden in a suitcase. And within a few years, it would begin changing the course of the war. The journey of that technology led directly to the skies above the Atlantic. By early 1943, a new type of aircraft patrol had begun appearing over the ocean at night. They were not fighters, and they were not bombers. Most were large patrol aircraft: Liberators, Sunderlands, and Catalinas, flying long, lonely routes above convoys. To the crews inside, the darkness outside the cockpit was absolute. But inside the aircraft, a small circular screen glowed green. On that screen, faint blips appeared across the sweeping line of radar. Each blip meant something was out there. Sometimes it was just a wave, sometimes a ship, but sometimes the signal was unmistakable, a submarine running on the surface. When that happened, the aircraft would turn sharply toward the signal. Down below, the U-boat crew might be enjoying the quiet confidence of the night surface run. Diesel engines throbbed as batteries charged. Crewmen stood watch on the deck, breathing the cold air after hours underwater. Then someone might hear an aircraft engine. A shout would ring across the deck. Aircraft. The order to dive would come instantly, but by then it was usually too late. The aircraft already knew exactly where they were. Searchlights snapped on. Depth charges rolled out of bomb bays. Explosions shattered the ocean around the submarine as it tried desperately to slip beneath the surface. What the submarine captain never saw was the small radar antenna mounted under the aircraft. Inside that antenna sat the tiny device that made the entire attack possible: the microwave transmitter. It had taken years of research and desperate wartime decisions to place the device in Allied aircraft. And once it arrived, the balance of the Atlantic War began shifting rapidly. Throughout 1943, the number of U-boats destroyed by aircraft rose dramatically. Submarines that had once dominated the Atlantic suddenly found themselves hunted. Their commanders adapted as best they could. They stayed submerged longer. They moved slower. They attempted to attack only under specific conditions. But the ocean was no longer their sanctuary. Aircraft equipped with microwave radar could detect submarines even through fog, rain, and darkness. The technology ignored the night. By May 1943, the situation had become so catastrophic for the German submarine fleet that Admiral Karl Donitz made an extraordinary decision. He temporarily withdrew most U-boats from the North Atlantic. The happy time was over. Historians would later describe that moment as the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. But the strange thing about that turning point is that it did not happen during a massive naval battle. It happened quietly, inside aircraft cockpits and radar rooms, because technology had changed the rules of the ocean. The impact of microwave radar did not stop with submarines. Once engineers realized how powerful the new systems were, they began installing them in other aircraft. Night fighter pilots, who had once struggled to locate enemy bombers in darkness, suddenly had electronic guidance. Inside the cramped cockpit of a night fighter, a radar operator sat behind the pilot watching another glowing screen. When enemy bombers appeared on radar, the operator would calmly guide the pilot closer. Left 10 degrees. Range 3 miles. Closing. Eventually the bomber would appear in the fighter's gun sight, often before the bomber crew even knew a fighter was nearby. The number of successful night interceptions climbed steadily. Bombers that had once relied on darkness for protection were suddenly vulnerable. Radar also began guiding bombers. British bomber crews flying over Europe often faced thick cloud cover that hid landmarks. Navigation errors were common. Entire bombing missions sometimes missed their targets by miles. Microwave radar solved that problem too. A new system called ground mapping radar allowed bombers to see the landscape below them electronically. Rivers appeared as bright lines on radar screens. Coastlines showed clear outlines. Cities formed distinctive shapes. Even through clouds, crews could identify their location and find their targets. The technology spread quickly through Allied forces. Naval ships installed microwave radar to detect enemy vessels. Coastal stations used it to track aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries relied on it to guide guns. Within a few years, radar based on microwave technology had become one of the most important tools of the Allied war effort. Factories in the United States began producing the devices in staggering numbers. The original prototypes had been handmade by scientists working with limited tools. American industry transformed those prototypes into mass-produced components. Factories ran day and night building them. By the end of the war, more than 1 million microwave transmitters had been manufactured. Every one of them traced its lineage back to those early wartime experiments. The Germans eventually captured some examples when Allied aircraft crashed behind enemy lines. Their engineers studied the devices carefully. They understood what they were looking at. But by the time they began trying to reproduce the technology, it was far too late. Their own radar systems relied mostly on older designs and longer wavelengths. Building large numbers of precision microwave devices required industrial resources that Germany no longer possessed in the final years of the war. Even when they understood the technology, they could not match the scale of Allied production. The technological gap continued widening until the end of the conflict. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, radar systems guided almost every aspect of the invasion. Ships detected approaching aircraft. Bombers navigated through weather and darkness. Pathfinder planes marked landing zones for paratroopers. Electronic eyes watched the battlefield everywhere. Most soldiers fighting that day never knew how much of the operation depended on radar. But without it, the invasion might have looked very different. After the war ended, the technology did not disappear. Many wartime inventions fade away once peace returns, but microwave technology moved in the opposite direction. It spread rapidly into civilian life. Air traffic control systems adopted radar for guiding aircraft. Weather forecasters began using it to track storms. Ships relied on it for navigation. The technology became a permanent part of the modern world. Then, almost by accident, it found a place in kitchens. In 1945, an engineer working for an American electronics company noticed something unusual while standing near a microwave transmitter used for radar experiments. The chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. Curious, he placed popcorn kernels near the transmitter. They exploded into fluffy, white pieces. Soon engineers were experimenting with cooking food using microwave energy. Within a few years, the first microwave ovens appeared. They were enormous machines at first, expensive and designed mainly for restaurants and ships. But the technology improved quickly. By the 1970s, microwave ovens were entering homes around the world. Today they sit quietly in millions of kitchens. Most people never think about the history behind them, but inside every microwave oven sits a direct descendant of the device that once helped patrol the Atlantic and hunt submarines in the night. The same technology that guided bombers through clouds and fighters through darkness now heats leftovers and pops popcorn. The connection between those two worlds seems almost unbelievable. Yet it began with a simple idea and a few determined scientists trying to solve an impossible wartime problem. They were not trying to invent a kitchen appliance. They were trying to save a country from starvation and defeat. And in the process, they created one of the most influential technologies of the 20th century. A small device, a burst of invisible energy, and a moment in history when seeing in the dark meant the difference between losing a war and winning it.